So let's talk about the massacre that just took place in the Crocus City Mall in Moscow. The last I checked, the body count was 143. That may have increased. And yesterday they were telling us that, what was it, 30 or 40 people were murdered, and the body count just kept increasing. Very, very horrific, extremely horrific. And those poor people, they thought that they were just going to go to a concert and have a fun Friday night, only to be butchered and mowed down and just slaughtered by these monsters. And I started looking at the Russian media because I was looking at the American media, and the American media was saying the same thing. You know, it's ISIS, it's this Afghan branch of ISIS, etc., etc. If you look at the Russian media, the Russians have a different perspective. The Russian perspective is that these were terrorists, but behind the attack is the United States, Ukraine, and NATO. And the Russians have pointed to some very interesting things. For example, the terrorists, as they were trying to escape justice, were headed towards Ukraine. And according to Putin, there was a window of escape that was prepared for the terrorists at the Ukrainian border, which means that there were people in Ukraine who knew that these people were coming, and they were going to allow them through the border. And as time goes on, we're going to be getting more and more information on this attack, and the facts will make this story even more strange than it's being presented by the American Western mainstream media. The fact is that these terrorists were headed towards Ukraine, and they wanted to go to Ukraine, which means that somebody over there at the Ukrainian border, somebody over there at the Ukrainian Border Security Service knew that these people were coming, and were going to let them in. So, what does that mean? If truly NATO and America and Ukraine are behind this attack, then what is the motive? What would be the motive to support such violence? What is the purpose of terrorism? The purpose of terrorism is not to kill. Killing is a means of terrorism, but it is not the end of terrorism. What is the end goal of terrorism? The end goal of terrorism is to get a reaction. That is the end goal of terrorism. It is to get a reaction so that the terrorists can then use the reaction as propaganda against their enemy, whoever that enemy may be. So if you look at, for example, let's just think of a hypothetical situation. A group of terrorists do a massacre because they hate the government, and the government reacts to the particular religious group or the ethnic group that the terrorists claim to represent, or that the terrorists claim to be fighting for, and the government persecutes that religious or ethnic group. And then the terrorists say, you see how evil the government is? You see how wicked and violent and tyrannical the government is? That's how terrorists work. That is their objective. That's their motivation. And so then the religious group or the ethnic group then says, look, the government is so evil. And then that creates even more of a violent reaction against the state, and the state begins to act more violently or more tyrannical, and then that makes that particular government look bad in the world stage. And then that government begins to lose legitimacy in the eyes of much of the world. This is the objective of terrorism. It is to get a reaction for a particular goal. We know this from, for example, Operation Gladio. What was the purpose of Operation Gladio? Operation Gladio was a NATO operation in which NATO intelligence services trained, armed, and backed particular right-wing terrorist cells, neo-Nazis, ultranationalist paramilitaries, and they wanted these far-right terrorists to commit acts of horrific violence. The biggest example of which was the Bologna Massacre, in which dozens of people were murdered in Italy by a bombing. And the purpose of these terrorist attacks was to blame them on the left. So Operation Gladio was about doing terrorist attacks and then blaming the terror attacks on the left or on the Soviet Union so that European countries could become nationalistic against communism, against the left, and against, ultimately, the Russians, the Soviets. So the purpose of the terrorism that was done under the Gladio operation was to get a reaction. That is the goal of terrorism, to get a reaction. We know this from the operation that never happened, Operation Northwood. The purpose of that operation was to do terrorist attacks in the United States to kill American citizens and then blame the terrorist attacks on the Cubans to get the Americans to hate Castro. It's to get a reaction. We see this right now. We see this right now with Israel. Hamas did a terrorist attack, a massacre of Jews. They killed over 1,000 people. And then Israel started bombing Gaza, and they're still bombing Gaza. And Israel is slaughtering civilians and killing a lot of people. And what is that doing? It's getting the world to hate Israel. Hamas is getting what it wants, which is to get the world to be enraged at Israel, to get the world to look at Israel and say, Israel is a terrorist state. Israel is committing genocide. Israel is committing mass murder. This is the reaction that Hamas wants. So the purpose of terrorism is to get a reaction. To get a reaction, to make the enemy look bad, and to delegitimize the enemy that the terrorists hate. So what would be the goal behind supporting a terrorist attack in Russia? Well, think about it. This is just my thoughts. I could be completely wrong on this. But the terrorists were Tajiks. Tajiks aren't exactly very popular in Russia. Even before these terrorist attacks, there was already some sort of prejudice against Tajiks because a lot of criminals in Russia are Tajiks and other people from Central Asia. And so by supporting a terrorist attack, you could get the Russians to hate on Muslims. You could get the Russians to hate Tajiks, to hate Chechens, Dagestanis, other Central Asians, and you could get the Russians to do a reaction against Muslims in Russia, to then provoke the Ummah, the Islamic world, to be enraged against Russia. And that would delegitimize Russia in the eyes of many, many people. So if the Russians respond against Muslims and they become excessive, this would be used as propaganda against the Russians to make the Russians look like they're all a bunch of prejudiced despots. Are the Russians going to fall for it? I don't think so. I have hope. But I think that this is the end goal. I think the goal, if the United States, if NATO, Ukraine, Western intelligence agencies like the CIA, MI5 or MI6, whichever one it is, were behind this attack, I think the goal would be to the motive would be to get the Russians to react against the Muslim population within the Russian Federation, and have the Russians act excessively to make the Russians look bad to the Muslim world, and then to get the Ummah to rise up against the Russians. Again, I've said this before. I've said this in one of my last videos, that the Achilles heel of Russia is the Dagestanis and the Chechens of the North Caucasus. The Islamic North Caucasus region in the Russian Federation is the Achilles heel of Russia. If you can get the Muslims of Dagestan and the Muslims of Chechnya and the Muslims of Ingushetia to revolt and to do a jihad against the Russian government, you could basically start a civil war within the Russian Federation. And it wouldn't be the first time. This happened back in the 1990s with the Russians fighting against the Chechens and the Dagestanis, and it was a very, very devastating and extremely violent war. There was a horrific massacre of Russian soldiers that happened called the Dagestani Massacre. Don't watch it. There's a video you can see of it, but I do not recommend anyone to watch it because it is absolutely horrific. But if you want an idea as to how diabolical these jihadis can be, I mean, just watch that video. But it was a very devastating war, and it's something that Russia does not want to repeat, which is why you will see, for example, videos of Putin acting very nice with Muslims and saying nice things about the Islamic religion. It's the reason why you will see Putin holding up the Quran saying that it's a holy book. All of these acts are just very political, and they are political gestures to maintain peace between the non-Muslim Russians and the Muslim Russians. But the Americans would just love, NATO, Ukraine, would just love to see a civil war happen within Russia to fragment that country and to cripple that country. So if NATO was behind this terrorist attack, the motive behind supporting such a terrorist attack would be to cause friction between the Russians and the Muslim population in order to get a jihad happening and to get the Russians to react excessively. And that would cause the Ummah, to the Islamic world, to hate on Russia. And it would really provide an opportunity for the Western media to say, look at how anti-Islamic the Russians are. And we've been seeing this sort of thing against China. I mean, how many times we've heard about China being excessive and being tyrannical against the Islamic Uyghur population. So that would provide perfect propaganda fodder for the Western media apparatus to propagandize against the Russians and to try to delegitimize the Russians. Anyway, those are my thoughts on that. And more and more information will come out on this story, and it will just, I think, more and more light is going to be shed on this story, and it's going to as time goes on, we're going to realize just how strange or stranger the story already is, because it's obviously very very suspicious. And another thing I want to say is, one thing I've noticed is that the world is changing so much from what it used to be 10 years ago. I remember 10 plus years ago, anytime a terrorist attack happened, people would automatically say, oh, look, Muslim, Sharia law, jihad. I was searching through Twitter for a while today, looking at what people have been saying about the Crocus City Mall massacre. And there are so many people on Twitter saying that this was the job of the CIA, that this was the job of the Ukrainian intelligence service, that this was the job of NATO, that this is a conspiracy. I'm not really seeing a whole lot of anti-Muslim talk or anti-Islamic talk. The world is changing. A lot of people have woken up to the fact that false flag attacks exist, that they have been going on for a very, very long time. People are learning about Gladio. People are learning about Operation Paperclip. People have learned about Operation Northwood. People have woken up to the reality of false flag attacks. And so now you look at Twitter, and most people are saying, oh yeah, CIA. I mean, from what I have seen, a lot of people are just saying CIA. Oh yeah, this is CIA. 10 plus years ago, people would be saying, oh my gosh, Islamic terrorism, the Quran, Surah chapter 9, Sharia law. I mean, now a lot of people are just saying, oh no, it's the CIA. It's the CIA. And of course, Islam does have a role in all of this. I mean, I saw a video today from the massacre, horrific video footage of some poor Russian guy in the mall laying down wounded. He had just been shot, and this terrorist has a knife in his hand, and he's slicing this Russian guy's throat over and over again. I posted it up on shootbot.com. I put a link on my YouTube channel. You can see it. Just slicing this poor Russian guy's throat over and over again, and he's saying Allahu Akbar, that Allah will give us the opportunity, Allah will give us victory over the kuffars, the non-believers, etc., etc. So of course Islam has a role to do with it, but Islam has been used by the CIA for a very long time. Terrorism has been being used by the CIA and other Western intelligence agencies for a very long time. Go back to the Cold War, go back to Gladio. It's a very, very real phenomena. And so 10 plus years ago, people just focused on Islam. Most people were focusing on Islam. But now you look at Twitter and it's just everyone's saying it's CIA, CIA, CIA. So a lot of people have read up on this stuff, and they are automatically being suspicious when these sorts of massacres take place, which is somewhat of a good thing, but it can also it's a good thing in a way, but it's also a bad thing in a way, because now when you have a massacre, people are automatically just going to say, oh, it's a red flag or a false flag attack, and they're not going to really think about the Islamic contribution in this violence. And that's not a good thing. We should also understand that fanaticism does play a role in it. But we should also, it's good in a way that more and more people are seeing the bigger picture in these sorts of catastrophes, and they're seeing that government does play a role. And it's important that we know that, because, well, terrorism is used as a means for political manipulation. And so why would we want to be manipulated? Let's not be manipulated. Let's not fall for the propaganda and do the reaction that they want us to do. So that's why I say that, in a sense, it is a good thing that people have opened up their eyes to this stuff. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.